Hi, I'm Slice.
And I'm Emily.
And welcome to another episode of Home Records, the podcast where we, two married musicians, pick an album at random from our 2,000-piece vinyl collection and discuss its personal and cultural importance.
I'm excited about this one.
Yes, so this is, just getting right into it, this is kind of the part two from our previous episode where we discussed the artist, the Japanese artist Haruomi Hosono, and his album Hosono's House.
Yeah, so why? Tell everyone why we wanted to do a part two of this.
So I think it's because there's another group that Hosono was involved with, also another seminal record that I think is very important to talk about in this historical context. You know, when in our last episode we talked about going to Japan, we went there for our honeymoon. And I did quite a bit of record shopping, and the record we're talking about today was actually one of the primary records I was looking for from Haruomi Hosono's other group that he formed called Yellow Magic Orchestra, or otherwise known as YMO.
Which to be honest, I did not really know a lot about Haruomi Hosono at all, but I did know of YMO. I had heard of that. And so I feel like, you know, if a lot of Americans are listening to this, they may have had some name recognition of that group.
Yeah, they would have been maybe more familiar depending on what side of Japanese music you're coming from or what side of music in general, because YMO was a synth pop outfit. And I first actually heard about this album from YouTuber, music critic Anthony Fantano. He talked about this record in a classic review. And so that's how I came across it. And yeah, it's one of those synth pop. It's not even. I wouldn't even say it's like a synth pop gem. It's kind of more than that. You know, it's considered a very influential album for a lot of different music genres.
Which, like, just to reflect back on our part one, if you remember him as a solo artist, that record was very folk rock, almost like Hawaiian influenced.
It's very exotica influenced.
Yes.
And that's the trajectory he continued for his next few solo records, including his second solo album called Tropical Dandy, which is one of my favorites. And then he released, you know, a couple other records like that. He sort of slowly delved into, you know, more synthesizer, electronic music, you know, very influenced by krautrock bands like Kraftwerk.
Yeah, and this is a totally different genre. This is all electronic music, which is a very interesting genre that I don't know a lot about. So I'm excited about this and excited to kind of keep diving deeper on an artist that we've talked about. Which do you feel like is bigger? Do you feel like him as a solo artist is bigger or YMO is bigger?
It depends who you talk to, because here's the thing. All the members of YMO are huge. They're all very well known and all very influential. It was kind of a supergroup, because this is how YMO came to be, is that all the members of YMO, they were all part of this collective of studio musicians in Japan called Tin Pan Alley. Haruomi Hosono was primarily a bass player. And then you had the second member, Ryuichi Sakamoto, who was a keyboard player primarily. And then you had Yukihiro Takahashi, the third member of YMO, who was a drummer. So they all played on records for various Japanese artists. And then they also collaborated on each other's records. Ryuichi Sakamoto put out his first solo record before joining YMO. And I believe Hosono's on it. And Takahashi was involved in it in a little bit too. And that's a great record as well. And Yukihiro Takahashi also did an album, his first solo album, which was actually more French pop influenced.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's also a really great record. They were all pre-established by the time that they came together, and Hosono was kind of the driving force in the sense of, like, he got everybody together and said, hey, we want to do the synth pop electronic music thing, you know, and everyone was into the idea. And so you know, they made their first album, which was self-titled, and it had a song on it called Firecracker, which was actually a cover of by an artist named Martin Denny, who was an exotica performer back in the early 60s, and who Hosono was obsessed with at the time. And so they did an electronic version of that song. And it ended up becoming kind of a hit in the States, actually. And it was sampled by hip-hop artists, and hip-hop DJs used it for breakbeats, and, was utilizing a lot of breakdancing culture. So that was kind of the first bug of YMO really coming to prominence. But really, it's this album that we're talking about, Solid State Survivor, that really became, as a whole, like their most influential album. And for many different music genres and fields, which you'll be hearing us talk about today.
And so one of the things, before we dive really deep into that album, one thing I love about this podcast is, as you know, we're not only podcast hosts, but we're also individual musicians ourselves, and we're also married. So the really fun thing about this record, some of our records have really fun stories as to how Slice got them or certain things about them. And this one to me is my favorite story about how you got a record, because I happened to be there because it was on our honeymoon.
Well, when we were planning going to Japan, one of the things I was planning on doing was visiting Tower Records in Shibuya, which is in Tokyo. And because I knew YMO was very well regarded in Japan. So, the second or third day we were in Tokyo, we went to visit Tower Records, and I pretty much bought nearly every YMO record. They had all of them, including this one, Solid State Survivor. And they also had some Yukihiro Takahashi and Ryuichi Sakamoto solo records. Didn't really find much Hosono stuff, too. Some of his stuff is really hard to come by for some reason.
Well, let's dive into this record. So for me, this record is unlike anything I've ever heard. And maybe that's because this is probably one of the first electronic albums I've personally listened to. But it's also interesting because it's kind of half instrumental. They do a few covers of some English songs, so a little bit of it is in English.
The original songs had the English lyrics on them.
Mm-hmm. And so, explain to people like me and maybe someone listening who isn't really familiar with electronic music why this was such an influential record and such a big leap in that genre.
I mean, you kind of have to hear it to kind of understand it, but at least the best I could put it into words is, you listen to this record. This was made and came out in 78, 79. So synth pop was just starting to, become a force in popular music. You had, like I mentioned before, you had Kraftwerk. You had some pioneering artists like Gary Newman, artists that were coming out of the post-punk scene like Joy Division, and bands that were utilizing, electronics in their in their sound, in their pop songs. And YMO were kind of leading that charge, but sort of coming from a very different place. And their songs, I think some people would call it techno, or or what hip hop artists would think about techno would come from this record, but they also were, trying to create pop songs in an inventive new way. And one of the things I always say, too, with this record is that it was influenced, like their last record, on video game music. But in a lot of ways, they influenced a lot of later video game music in the 80s, And to that point, there was a big movement starting to happen around that time period called city pop in Japan. Mm-hmm. And that was where you had these artists that were making these very slick, very smooth, sort of yacht rockish, jazzy rock type of music. And YMO wasn't entirely city pop, but the sounds they were using were used in a lot of city pop records. And like I said, they were all kind of collaborating with each other, and they all played on records from those city pop artists too. So everything was very, everything was sort of, kind of happening at once. But I think it was this record that really solidified YMO in terms of their sound, in terms of their influence. They made a few other records later on that kind of went into more pop-ish territory, not so much city pop, but more like synth pop, even more so than this record.
Music always reflects the culture. It just does. That's one thing that I love about it, is if you can always learn more about the culture of a place by listening to the music that comes out of there. And in Japan, there's the arcade district if you ever get a chance to visit. And literally every section of that area in Tokyo is filled with arcades. It's filled with anime. It's filled with Pokemon. It's filled with all these things. And you can understand why music like this that sounds like video games. It just reminds us so much of that electronic, fast-paced kind of feel would come out of a place like that. It just makes a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is always interested to me, I'm someone that's I make country, I make Americana music, and so the focus in those genres is live instruments when you're recording. And so one thing that I think is interesting is obviously in electronic music, you're using drum loops, you're using synthesizers, you're using, all of these electronic things that are not real people. I'm curious from a recording standpoint how that changes the creative process.
Well, here's the thing. This is early electronic music, so they didn't do any of that.
I want to know more about that. No, that's cool.
Yeah, there were no sequencers really at that point. There were no sequencers. Everything had to be playing real time. Like I said, Takahashi was a drummer. So he played real drums. And they had invented a version of this thing that Kraftwerk invented, which were like these kind of drums that you played with. It was like an electronic drum that you physically played, and that's what created that sort of electronic sound. And to kind of further explain it, YMO, when they would go out to play live, there's a great concert film they did that's on YouTube from the Greek Theater in LA. And the thing was, when they played live, there was actually kind of a fourth sort of unsung hero of YMO, and his job was because they were still using old modular Moog synthesizers. They were still using the type of synthesizers that you had to literally switch inputs and output cables to get a specific sound for a specific part of the song. And so they needed somebody to work that in real time. So while they were playing the keyboards. So, and I'll tell you real quick. Yeah, and that person was named Hideki Matsutake, who is on this record credited as microcomposer programming. So he was literally moving cables around so that everyone could play the sounds that they needed to in real time.
That's fascinating, because I would imagine if you're making electronic music today, it is not like that.
Not necessarily. Everything can be sequenced and programmed pretty quickly. You can copy and paste things pretty quickly, but there was none of that. Everything was still analog. There was no digital. Like
Yeah.
We still didn't have digital recording by that point, So
See, I think this is fascinating. If you're listening and you've never been in a recording studio, like even what I do, which is a lot more live, it's not electronic at all, we'll even take things and like copy and paste vocal sections, like a real voice in different spots if needed. So like the idea that something that sounds so electronic, that's so video game based, is all done live essentially, and that's a performance that's captured. That's a really, really interesting thought if you've seen that process of kind of being able to loop drums and things like that.
I mean, looping really wasn't a thing. I mean, you had sequencers in some ways, but you couldn't loop sequencers. You had to, if you had something that had an arpeggiator on it, because that's what really existed before sequencers was arpeggiators, you still had to play that for as long as the recording lasted. You couldn't just hit a button and let it be automatic. I mean, for some ARPs you could do it because that's what they are, ARPs, but you still had to like record them to tape in real time with everything else going on.
Yeah.
Again, we didn't have, digital interfaces or anything like that. Everything was still analog.
Yeah.
So, and because, this band, they're very perfectionist about, their compositions and the way things sounded, so it took some time to make this record, but really they just worked all hours of the day, I think, on this album, and that's why it came out so perfect, pretty much,
I love it. I want to know specifically about the songs. Do you have a favorite on the record?
I think, the funny thing for me is that I think my favorites are actually The Usual Suspects for this record. So
that is unusual that you're picking the usual
Well,
usual hits.
well, I think in some regards these are also the most influential ones, though, or the ones that have kind of made the most impact. Being the third track, Raideen, which was actually the first YMO song I ever heard, and because when I heard it, I'm like, this is Sonic the Hedgehog. It is literally Sonic the Hedgehog.
It really is. Well, and so we never talk about what our favorite tracks are before we start recording. And I wrote down my favorite track was number 3, right?
Yeah. It is such a memorable melody, and it uses all those synthesizers that are like, that pretty much is the sound of video games for like the next 10 years,
Yeah, and it has like this interesting I put down, it has like this interesting like swooshing sound that I just hadn't ever quite heard before. And I think when music is purely instrumental or electronic like this, I feel like that's the part that makes me go, that's really, really interesting, as if it's a sound that I haven't quite heard yet.
And that's, I think, something that gets like, I'm not as hip to a lot of modern EDM, but I just kind of feel, and this is maybe from my own ignorant opinion, is that, I feel like melody gets kind of waylaid a bit in modern EDM,
Yeah.
I mean, there's some electronic music artists that I heard that like that kept pretty intact, but it's something I kind of miss, which is probably why I don't gravitate towards it as much. It's like, it's nice to hear a dance beat and a track, but it's like, I need some sort of melody to kind of latch on to.
And this has that motif.
It has that, in all the songs, pretty much.
Which is such a funny word to use, because motif is a very classical word that they use to talk about a melody that repeats over and over again. It's kind of like the way we think of hooks in pop music.
Well, that's the thing.
But that's exactly what this is.
Well, because Ryuichi Sakamoto was kind of raised up on classical. I think out of all the three, he's probably the most like classical based composer,
so he probably would have thought about that in terms of kind of creating these songs.
Yeah, he was definitely the most composition based songwriter of the group, I would say. Although ironically this song was written by Yukihiro Takahashi. He actually wrote this, but he's also very like, I think kind of the best of both worlds. He's kind of the middle ground between pop song and composition, and that's the thing, because they all have that composer sensibility. I think Hosono comes the most from the pop world, because he was in the rock bands, and he grew up on the Beatles, and things like that. So,
and this record is only 8 songs long. It's four songs on the first side, 4 songs on the second side. Like, it's pretty short in terms of albums in today's standards, for sure.
Well, it took a long time to make, like I was kind of alluding to before. So it's like, if we could get it in an album is worth, then we would have done our bit,
And the other thing that's really interesting is there covers of American rock tunes. There's Day Tripper on this.
And actually, that's the only one. That's the only American song on the... Actually, not American, it's British. But
what is Behind the Mask, then?
Okay, so
because that's another cover, isn't it?
Nope. So Behind the Mask, it's funny because I teach songwriting, or I teach music as my day job. And when we talk about production, we talk about demos, and we talk about a little bit of electronic music, and we talk about synthesizers, and I always bring up YMO. It's not in the curriculum, but I do it because, it's the Lord's work, but I digress. So,
I mean, if you're going to talk synthesizers, from everything I've heard, they know they're synthesizers.
Yeah, exactly. But I always come up to Behind the Mask when I'm talking about this, and I always leave off with saying, Behind the Mask has probably the most interesting shelf life of any song of almost any song, really. So Behind the Mask, on the record by YMO on Solid State Survivor, it's sung by Sakamoto through a vocoder, and singing words in English, because there was I think the lyricist is an American guy, Chris Mistel. So
yes, I think that's why I thought it was a cover.
So that's the original version.
Okay.
So a few years later, this song actually came across. I don't know exactly who it came across that led to this, but it was actually supposed to be recorded by Michael Jackson for the album Thriller.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yep.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Michael did record a demo. He rewrote the lyrics, some of the lyrics, just to kind of, I think, match his vibe a bit more. And they recorded a demo. The engineer, I think, basically he just took the original YMO track and just had Michael singing over it, which it's mostly instrumental anyway, and you could have easily, turned down that vocoder vocal. But it didn't end up on Thriller because there was some issue with the songwriting royalty distributions with Sakamoto because he wrote the music for it. So because of that, I think they just they couldn't come to an agreement for whatever reason at that time.
That's interesting.
So it was inevitably left off the album. Now, the song, you can actually find the demo of the song on one of the deluxe editions of Thriller, but they also did do a fully produced version that ended up on the posthumous album Michael in 2010 that came out like a couple of years after he had passed away. So you can hear a fully produced version of Behind the Mask by Michael Jackson.
Can you imagine like having your song taken off the Thriller record because they couldn't figure out how to pay you? Essentially, like, that's what you're saying. I would be kicking myself for the rest of my life because Thriller is the top selling album of all time, or at least it was.
Non-compilation it is. Non-compilation.
I mean, oh my gosh. I mean, that paycheck would have been crazy.
The funny thing is, to be fair, I mean, if you listen to even the demo, even if you listen to the completed posthumous production, I think, in my opinion, I think it would have been a bit out of place on Thriller compared to everything else. Maybe it was
meant to be anyway.
Yeah, like, I mean, he was like, oh yeah, I want to record it. I wrote these lyrics, but it would have definitely fell out of place, I think, compared to, the other, like, Quincy Jones joints and things like that, and Rod Temperton joints. But
if that doesn't, like, help people understand how influential this record is, the fact that there was a song from it that was almost added to the Thriller record, I feel like that is a great, as someone who doesn't know a lot about it, to me that says a lot.
Well, yeah, but the story doesn't even end there. So it was left off Thriller, and one of the studio musicians that played on Thriller, worked on Thriller with Michael, was a guy named Greg Gaines, who has also worked with Stevie Wonder. And after his stint with Michael, went on to work with Eric Clapton. I think, in my opinion, I don't know this for sure, but I like to believe that Greg told Eric, like, yeah, I was working on Thriller, and, we had this song, we didn't end up cutting it, or we didn't end up finishing it. Maybe you could do something with it. So Eric Clapton actually recorded a version of Behind the Mask with Michael's lyrics, and it ended up on a terrible album called August from the mid-'80s. And when I mean terrible, I mean his cover of Behind the Mask is probably the best track on that album. That's, and the track is pretty good, but everything else is pretty terrible on that album. And I bought that album like a few months ago just for Behind the Mask.
But we own it.
Yeah. But we will not be talking about that album because the only thing we're talking about on that album is Behind the Mask. But yeah, funny. Clapton's version is like, I mean, it's basically Michael's version without the R&B programming and things like that. It definitely sounds a little off-putting hearing Clapton sing what Michael would have sung.
Yeah, those are definitely not the same voices.
No, they are not.
They're very, very much
No, they're not. Yeah, so that's the very strange and interesting shelf life of Behind the Mask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. I mean, this whole record is really fascinating. The whole group is fascinating. I mean,
they're all incredible virtuosos, not just instrumentally, but just compositionally, And I mean, this is like the record that kind of really put them on the map. And one thing I will add, because I like to, we're talking about this record, but I also want to talk about sort of the history of YMO a bit, and its members. We've alluded to it a little bit in the last episode. We're talking about Hosono's career, and he went on to do a lot of other different things later on. But the record they made after this was actually a mini album. It's a title with a symbol. So, and like I said, it was a mini album, but it was this weird album that had like this like these Japanese comedy bits in between songs. And yeah, it's called Infinity Multiplies, which sounds like a math formula. Anyways, but one of the notable tracks from that album, that mini album, was a cover of Tying Up by Archie Bell and the Drells, from the 60s. You know, it was a soul cover. And it was because of that cover that they became the first and I think only Japanese act to perform on Soul Train.
Now, to make sure everyone knows what Soul Train is.
Everyone knows what Soul Train is. But if you don't, if you live under a rock like my wife,
I know what Soul Train is now because I married you.
My point stands. But yes, the pinnacle of soul music on television, soul artists perform and audiences dance to soul music. There have only ever been, I think, kind of before that, two non-African American artists on there, and that was Average White Band, the Scottish funk group, and David Bowie.
Yeah,
they both perform. Oh no, there's actually three. Also, Elton John performing Benny and the Jets, because that was a #1 R&B record.
And Soul Train had the potential to break an artist, to just introduce it to so many people. The same way our talk show performances do now. Like if you perform on SNL, it would be the equivalent of doing that.
Pretty much, you know. The funny thing about Soul Train, though, it is like it was kind of like American Bandstand, where you kind of lip sync to your track and things like that. There were some exceptions, but YMO were slated to perform on there, and they performed Tighten Up and Firecracker, and that was like, you know, that I think that was kind of what really solidified their influence on hip hop, really, because hip hop was just kind of starting out in the mainstream at that point. Not necessarily like the real hip hop acts, there was still manufactured hip hop, but YMO really kind of solidified their place, because it was like people dancing to it like they would dance to break beats, you know. So YMO continued making records, and then, you know, they kind of broke up, and then they reformed a few times over the years. But Hosono continued making music. He continued making synth pop. He made ambient music. He made boogie woogie music, country music, blues music. You know, he dabbled in pretty much everything you could think of. Ryuichi Sakamoto went on to do film scores, most notably winning the Oscar for doing the score for The Last Emperor, along with David Byrne. And he also did Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, which the theme of that film is probably one of the most recognizable film score melodies of all time. And they still play it during the holidays in some commercials and things like that here and there. And Takahashi continued collaborating with them on and off, and continued doing his own records as well. So they all had very fruitful and, you know, kept themselves very busy throughout their lives. Sakamoto and Takahashi passed away a few years ago, but Hosono's still around, and he's actually been kind of embracing more of the sort of renewed interest in a lot of his older catalog, including YMO. And he still does some YMO songs live occasionally whenever he does perform, but he's definitely, I think, embraced the younger crowd and younger audiences that have become interested in his music. And especially because during the lockdown, city pop kind of had a resurgence because of TikTok. And again, even though YMO was not entirely exactly city pop, they were still there while that was all happening, and they were still part of the records being made, you know, as individuals.
I feel like if I could pick one word for this group, it would be reinvention, you know. And I think like just Hosono going from the record we talked about last episode, which is very folk rock, to something that is so electronic and influential in both genres, both worlds. And I think, you know, just on a personal level, you know, I just am curious, like, have you ever felt the need to reinvent yourself musically like that?
I think it all felt like a natural progression, especially if you listen to all of his albums leading up to YMO, because I think it was probably by there were two records. I mean, because he did the Tropical Trilogy, the Exotica Trilogy, of Tropical Dandy, Bon Voyage, And then the third one, Pariso, which was the first time he had worked with Takahashi and Sakamoto, because that was credited as Haruomi Hosono and the Yellow Magic Band. And that was where we started to hear synthesizers. But he also was dabbling with synthesizers on another collaborative record before that called Cochin Moon. And so it was like, yeah, he was becoming curious about synthesizers because it was new technology at the time. Right. And because Japan has always been seen as, or at some point they were kind of regarded as being on the cutting edge of technology. So I think it was just this natural curiosity of, you know, what we can use to make music that really led to the reinvention. So I don't know. I don't think it necessarily was reinvention for the sake of reinvention. I think it was more of just being curious about, you know, what is possible. And Sakamoto was also, I think, in that, like he was the first one to kind of take that on with his first solo record specifically, you know, and that kind of, I think, naturally coalesced into the three of them getting together to do this YMO thing.
One thing I've loved, like in my career, is meeting different musicians and figuring out what is it that moves them to create things. Like for me, I think it's always, you know, trying to figure out a way to express emotion, and so I feel like I'm always drawn to storytelling and very lyric driven. But I'm so interested in people like these artists who I think are driven by a curiosity of sound. Like, what if I can make this kind of sound, or this is in my head? What equipment do I use to make that? Because it's such a different way of approaching music, and it's just fascinating. And in a lot of ways, it's what moves production forward.
And I agree with that. And I think, you know, you look at music from many different cultures, the more you listen and the more you kind of dig into it, the more you understand the different mindsets that exist within different cultures and sort of their, not just their reasons for making music, but just, you know, their approach and how they are attempting to achieve what they want to. And that's why YMO kind of sticks out a little bit more, why they're sort of a little bit separated from the city pop, because city pop is about like escapism. It's sort of this very futuristic, optimist type of idea, which never really quite existed. Maybe in some form, in some ways, but you know, it wasn't. That was kind of what it is. There was a nostalgic element to it, and that's the one thing I think that YMO actually doesn't have that city pop does, is they don't have like sort of that nostalgic factor. There's nothing nostalgic sounding about YMO's records. I think that's the big not. I think that's the big difference, because YMO, you know, it sounds like the future. I think musically it sounds a lot like that.
Yeah, it either sounds modern or even futuristic. And that's, you know, because it's electronic, and I think in a lot of ways.
It also doesn't have a lot of the sort of jazzy or jazz rock type of chord progressions and sounds that city pop has. It was definitely more kind of pop music based. That's also a fundamental difference as well. I've been listening to a lot of city pop lately, so I've been
it's top of mind.
And actually it's kind of helped me kind of figure out how that discerns from what YMO and sort of their camp were creating at that same exact time.
So I want to ask you about the cover, because the cover is one very Japanese, which I love. I love the colors in it, and they're the three band members, but then there are these two other characters. Are they mannequins? Like, they look like dolls.
They're mannequins.
Okay.
They're mannequins. On a side note, I do want to highlight as well, there is also another unsung hero of the YMO camp, and she's not necessarily featured on this album, but she does participate with the band live, and that's Akiko Yano, who would be married to Sakamoto not too long after this, but she's also an incredible artist in her own right, and she was one of the touring keyboardists for YMO around the time that this album was made. If you haven't heard her records, definitely check them out. And like I said, you know, definitely check out the discography of all the members of YMO. There's it's such a rabbit hole, which is why, when we went to Japan and I went to Tower Records, I pretty much scoured, finding all the YMO records, as many Sakamoto records, Takahashi records, and yet they had no Hosono. I had to
that was the white whale.
That was the white whale,
really
which we found. Yeah, and listen to our previous episode if you haven't already to hear that story.
Well, I'm going to say something a little controversial. I personally am probably not a big electronic music person.
I really am not either, but I kind of put this in more the synth pop canon, which I'm a huge fan of.
Yeah, I was going to say, like
80s synth pop,
if someone's listening and they're not really into like EDM or electronica, like why would you still say, hey, give this one a shot, give this record a shot?
I mean, there's two reasons for that. One of them is because, I think it's important to, I think now more than ever, to embrace the music of other cultures. And if you're going to look for a record that you feel like has some common ground with what you're already familiar with and what you've heard, this would be the record to start off with, with Solid State Survivor by Yellow Magic Orchestra. I think it's definitely in this album. There's definitely other incredible Japanese artists that have also made their splash. Hosono's discography, it's so rich. Some of it's hard to come by. A lot of it's on YouTube, not on streaming, but a lot of that is great. And if you're into classical or film scores, Sakamoto's discography is great for that. Takahashi's done a lot of different things, so definitely get into him. Don't sleep on him. I have a few of his records I still need to get through. But this is kind of where everything just coalesced all at once into a really great and memorable piece of art.
I really love what you said about, not being, being aware of other cultures' music. In our very first episode, we did Nebraska by Bruce Springsteen. And we said multiple times in that episode, if I had to show anyone a record and, just to introduce them to American culture, this would be probably top on my list. And I really feel like if you feel that way about Japanese culture and understanding the kind of music that is there, because music again is always an example, it's always a reflection of the culture that's there. Probably this record and the last record we talked to are some of the ones that I would share.
Well, what I would also add too is that they are that, but they're also kind of subversion of that too, because, and I said this in the previous episode talking about Hosono's house, is that a lot of Japanese culture in terms of art had kind of been lost or really kind of put to the side because of the effects of World War II. So people were trying to find their identity as Japanese artists, because before Hosono's house, and really actually before Haruomi Hosono's second group, Happy End, Japanese rock bands would sing in English. They would sing in English. Even I think Hosono's first band, April Fool, they would primarily sing in English. But then when Happy End came around, they're like, no, we're going to sing in Japanese. Because up to that point, that was the argument. But then once Happy End had some success, their second album is considered sort of the catalyst, actually, rather, of city pop, even though it was psychedelic rock or folk rock. But that was the album. Those were the Happy End was the band that kind of laid that argument to rest. And that was when all the Japanese musicians kind of came up and said, oh, we can be ourselves. We can do this while also being influenced by Western music. We try to find our identity. And that's really what's made Hosono's work, solo work, really subversive in that way. Is like there's that influence of the West, but it's also flirting with Japanese identity, or that the exotica thing, where it's really subverting Pacific Islander identity. And he would go on to do that in various other projects, especially the album Pacifica that he did with one of the artists was on that was Tatsura Yamashita, who is the king of city pop, And so if you listen to that record, that's kind of the proto city pop record. So that's one of the most interesting things, I think, when we're looking at this record, because again, there's a Beatles cover on here, Day Tripper. They were all huge Beatles heads, you know. So you're going to find things familiar, but you're also going to be having your expectations subverted. It's, we think of J-pop and K-pop these days, with BTS and Pink Pantherist and, Blackpink, all these groups, well, and some of them are K-pop. There's also Korean city pop, which is a whole other thing, but even some of that is the same has similarities to Japanese city pop, but it all really starts with this record, Solid State Survivor, and a lot of the Hosono stuff.
Well, and I think there's a lot of probably American audiences who don't understand, current modern Japanese artists.
A lot of English speaking audiences.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I think one of the things that I love about Japanese culture is they have preserved their traditional music so well. So I think a lot of people have an understanding of what kind of traditional Japanese music sounds like, but to know what like the youth are creating today and what people who are pushing music in that culture today, what they're trying to do, I think it's really important to be up to date on that and to understand it and to understand that it's not coming from just traditional Japanese music. It's coming from a lot of different inspirations, including the West, including different things that they're experiencing in their own worlds. And I think that all that's really important, and you can hear that on these records.
But that's actually kind of the reinvention that happened,
right?
Because in those happy end days, because Hosono has said himself, it felt like there was like, it's not that there wasn't traditional Japanese culture. It just felt like because World War II kind of, created this separation of generations in an obvious way. Mm-hmm. That's why by the late 60s, they felt very disconnected from that. And I think there's been efforts to try to preserve that even more now than ever. But at that time, people were still recovering. They were still like 10 to 15 years away from their own economic boom too. Right. So Japanese artists were looking for, the only identity they felt like they could rely on was Western music. And until Happy End came around, then that's when it felt like we could create our own new identity as Japanese people to this popular music that was happening.
So that's a little bit about YMO's record.
Yep, Solid State Survivor.
And I hope there's some people who've never heard of this record, and maybe it was really interesting to learn about something probably really different and from a different culture even. We always end our episodes with two of the same questions every time. And the first one, really the only prereq for the records we cover is that it is in some way influential to the culture. Mm-hmm. It can be from any genre, it can be from any time period, but for some reason we think that it has changed music history in some way. So that's one of our questions that we always end on is, why does Solid State Survivor matter to the culture?
And I will say it again, because reiterating it is very important, especially for an album like this. It influenced synth pop, it influenced hip hop, it influenced video game music, and all the members of YMO have been influential in their own unique ways, pre and post YMO. And as far as Japanese music, this is, you go to Tower Records, and really any Tower Records, but going to the one in Shibuya, and in the vinyl section of popular music, a YMO and its respective members take up an entire wall.
Yeah,
that's
which is unlike any other artist. That is unique.
Really, it's YMO. You also have some of the city pop guys like Yamashita and other artists like that for sure. Although I wasn't paying attention to city pops. I was just focused on YMO at the time. So if I went back there and took a second glance, I'm sure I would find them too.
No, YMO had its own corner. It was its own giant wall on display. Like, it was just different than the other groups for sure.
It really was, And incidentally, they've actually began to reissue the YMO albums, or actually not even issue for the very first time the YMO albums in the States, some of them. Mm-hmm. So now you can find them as non-imports, which is really incredible, and I think a testament to this renewed interest in city pop, but just this renewed interest in what they're doing, especially again with Hosono, kind of embracing his older work and its interest with younger audiences. So that's why I consider this record and this group and its respective members immensely influential.
And then the last question of our podcast episode is always, why should someone take a chance? Why should they listen to the record? If they haven't listened to this record before, why would they take some time out of their week this week to maybe check it out?
I think in this record there is a little bit of something for everybody. And, if anyone has ever been interested in Japanese music, this is a great, great, great starting point. And that was the thing, is I found out about this record only a few years ago, and it only took this album to really get down a rabbit hole of so many different albums.
You are
and
in a rabbit hole, I feel like, of these artists for sure.
Of Japanese music in that time period.
Yeah.
You'll hear familiar things. You'll hear the origins of a lot of what later became video music and influences in techno and hip hop, and it's such an enriching world of music, and if you are really interested in enriching yourselves in a world outside of the terrible one we are all living in currently, some more than others, then I think this would be a very fun curiosity.
Yeah, I would say for me, I would tell someone this record will help stretch your mind as far as what is possible sonically. I think for me, it just made me go, wow, I haven't thought about using that sound before, or wow, I haven't heard things put in that way before. I think that is a very cool thing for a record to do. And then also just culturally, like we said earlier, I think it's really important for people to hear music from different cultures and understand different cultural perspectives. I just think like overall this music will expand what you think is possible.
And that's what I'm looking forward to in this podcast too. There will be many moments where we will be exploring records from other cultures, from other countries, and just not only how influential the record was for that culture itself, but how they have had some influence in Western music or in other cultures per se, and there are of course artists that have made records, English speaking artists that have utilized the sounds of other cultures and countries in their own work, and we'll be talking about that too. And that's kind of the overall idea. It's a pretty open territory of where the music comes from that we will talk about on this podcast.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of Home Records. We just want to say we've loved sharing this new adventure with you guys. Thank you for showing your support, telling us what records you want us to cover. This has been a really fun new journey for us.
Yes, and if you like what you've been hearing, you could follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever podcasts are available. And if you also like to show your support even further, just please give us a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen in, and just be sure to spread the word to all your friends and family
and enemies.
So thank you once again, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye guys.
Bye.